Hello and welcome back to Radio 2. So we're currently busy with Chapter 5, and what we're doing today, we're starting with Module 2.12, which is compiling news, sport, traffic, and weather. Those might not seem super important, but they all are, okay? All of those have their own elements of importance, starting with the news. And when it comes to news, there are specific things that you need to look at, specific styles, and something that we'll be looking at in the next lecture, which is citizen journalism. So when the citizens, the people on the streets bring you stories. So there's a lot that's going into this, okay? If you want to follow along, we'll be using both textbooks for this. So from Next Level Radio, we'll be looking at page 181 and 182. And then from Valerie Geller's book, Beyond Powerful Radio, we'll be looking at pages 217 to 236. Okay, so that's the two that we'll be looking at today. And with that, let's get into compiling news. So there are 4 pillars of content that are important in radio. Regardless of the kind of radio station, these 4 factors will always be present, okay? First and foremost, a radio station must serve to inform its listeners. The very first types of information that are critical when it comes to informing listeners are those that affect the listener in their direct environment, aka my surroundings. And these comprise of news, sport, traffic, and weather. News is the segment of content that a listener can obtain every hour, sometimes even twice an hour, depending on the radio station, in a neatly packaged bulletin or report that contains a number of stories with supporting information. At most radio stations, a news bulletin is followed by a report on the sport or the traffic and the weather. Sport is important because it's a particular type of news that garners a lot of interest from any listener base. So we're going to be talking about the process involved in selecting different sports on which to report and how to tell great stories of the athletes, the players, and the coaches involved in specific sports. Obviously, at the moment, that's something that'll be very applicable because of the Olympics. So in this case, normally what they would do is they would add in a couple of more sport bulletins specifically, or they'd have a specific sport feature purely centered around the happenings of the Olympics. Sport as a subject can unify provinces and nations with its ever-changing environment. So it's that thing about who gets picked up, who gets dropped, what qualifies, and who doesn't, who gets injured, and who makes a comeback. There's always so much to write about and to share on air. And then we have the weather and the traffic. These need live and regular updating because every person is affected by the weather and or the traffic. Each person waking up in the morning, regardless of what their day contains, wants to carry out their plans with as much efficiency and pleasure as possible. Think about it. When you wake up, you don't go, I'm excited to have a miserable day. You want to have a pleasurable, nice day. And this can be dampened by things like what you're wearing when you leave the house if it's pouring with rain, or if the wind is, 60 kilometers an hour. So something like wearing the wrong shoes because you didn't know it was drizzling outside can ruin your day because you can step in a puddle and get water in your shoes. Or if you are driving on the way to work or to your classes and you discover there's a massive sinkhole in the road which you accidentally drive into, that's going to put a damper on your day. Or if a road has been closed and you have to take a detour which you weren't planning on, so it's an extra 10 minutes out of your day, so it's all these kinds of things that are really important. Even though we don't think of it constantly, it is things that influence our day-to-day lives. Within the next 12 lessons, we're also going to look at the critical types of content and understand how to source, write, report, and present them to a radio audience. So how do you build a great news team? What do you think it takes? News broadcasting is really 2 separate jobs. The first is covering the big story at an event of such magnitude that it affects the lives, well-being, or safety of your audience. And then the other is covering everything else. So that's the 2 separate jobs. On big news days, it's not so important to worry about being creative. On those days, you just gather the facts and you get them to air as quickly as possible. Give your listeners what they need to know. On the slower days, so that's most of the time normally, the news is like an insurance policy. Your newscast is in place, covering the day-to-day events of life so that people know where they can find the information and where to go on the big news day. Big news days are the days that journalists live for, when the adrenaline is pumping and the stories just seem to write themselves. Every day, the stories you choose should affect your audience in some way. So you need to pick items that connect listeners to what is happening in their community, what's new, what's interesting, what's absurd. Give audience talkable topics and entertain them with information. So every day can't be a day where we hear that COVID broke out in Wuhan and about all the people that died there, and then suddenly it started spreading to the rest of the world, and just all the news stories that happened since then. Do you remember last year and the end of the previous year was a good year for news in the sense of there was always all these COVID stories that was going on that had to be spoken about from all the different angles. Okay. Yes, by now we're very over it. But there was a point where we would all tune in simply to hear what is happening. We wanted to see the numbers. We wanted to see what's going on with the vaccines, what's going on across the world, etc. Radio news can be much more exciting than many people realize. By doing what radio does best, which is getting information from the scene of an event to the air quickly and describing an event so listeners can visualize what's happening, by doing this, we're using the most powerful tools we possess, which is immediacy and imagery. Keep in mind that we're no longer just a radio station. Every newsroom now needs to function as a digital news organization. So the mission is to inform, entertain, and engage as many people as possible and as many times as possible across the day on various platforms. So FM radio, the web, instant messaging, microblogging, HD radio, Facebook, smartphones, and the list goes on, okay, with regards to the growing media available for broadcasters. So to build a great news team, network news executive Bernard Gershon looks for the following traits. Okay, so this is what he looks for when he's looking to appoint someone or when he's looking to appoint a new news person. First and foremost, the desire or hunger within that individual. So desire or hunger is crucial. The best employees always want to improve their performances. They display this by asking for additional assignments, wanting to learn different parts of the business, asking to be sent on training seminars. They also understand that getting better requires hard work and long hours, like the rest of this industry does. Look for people who are aggressive when it comes to getting interviews, going after callers, going prime time. So an effective news person is a storyteller who exudes energy. So someone who can generate enthusiasm and excitement from listeners and are interested in the topic, in the caller, in the job. Okay, so it's a storyteller. The most successful news operations hire reporters and staff with a sense of a mission to both the station and the community who understand that super serving the listener is important. Then it's important to reward people for excellent work. Okay, you need to nurture your team the same way that you need to nurture your presenters and your producers. If a newscaster tells the truth in an interesting and, when appropriate, entertaining way, he or she can keep the attention of the listeners, and that's what we want. A good reporter might cover a fire so descriptively that the listeners can almost taste the smoke in the backs of their throats. That's a good storyteller. When you create word pictures, your news story is almost like a movie. News should be a great storytelling. Then it will never be boring. News needs to be serious. It needs to be credible. You still need to remember to focus on how to keep or attract the audience within this credible, serious framework. Information is available everywhere. So on the radio, online, over the internet, on your phone, in a newspaper, in a magazine, on a TV, okay? There's information. We have an information overload. So why should a listener come to you for information? Because that listener cannot hear you, the storyteller, anywhere else. That's why. Storytelling is the power you have to make the listener experience an event or take in information in a unique way. Be creative, put your heart into it. Keep your opinion out of it, it's news, and get your facts right. Find a way to make the story yours. So don't be interchangeable, be an individual. And then lastly, whenever possible, record and use natural sound. So what does that mean? That means that if you're covering a parade or a festival or a demonstration, this is obvious, okay? Use the sound of the event underneath your report to give the listeners a feel of being on the scene. Less obvious and less frequency heard are the sounds of more routine events. So think creatively, use sounds to help you tell your story. If you're doing a story on daycare centers, it makes sense to record children at play and run that underneath your report. Remember, don't settle. It doesn't have to be boring. TV has pictures, but radio does too. Radio can become visual by posting photos and video on your website. But in radio, the most powerful tool is still the imagination. By using sound and describing events and people in detail, we can stimulate imagination in a way TV simply can't. What happens when you listen to a boring news bulletin? Do you think that you can recall the stories that you heard? The first story, the second. What's the last story? Was there sport? If news is presented in a boring manner, listeners tune out or you zone out, okay? So mentally, you tune out. There's one broadcast reporter who's never boring, and his name is Mike Sugarman. He works for KCBS Radio and KPIX TV in San Francisco, and he's been known for taking the Dallas story and bringing them to life. Because he's creative, Sugarman's work is equally good on the hard news and on the lighter features. Imagination and detail are part of what makes him a master storyteller. He wants reporters to take risks. His advice is first to learn the rules of traditional journalism, then to break them. After you learn what you're supposed to do, you can cover a story and figure out what all of the other reporters will be doing. Then do something different. Often the resulting story will generate comments such as, "What was that?" But eventually the comments turn into, "Hey, that was good. How did you think of that?" Okay. Occasionally you'll still hear, "What was that?" But if you don't make mistakes every now and then, you aren't pushing the envelope far enough. He has one warning though, and that is to avoid making mistakes with actual facts. If you're factually challenged too often, you'll lose your credibility, which is all a reporter has, okay? It's all a reporter owns. Another amazingly creative reporter is Warren Levinson. He's the head of the Associated Press Bureau in New York City. And Levinson is a master of taking seemingly boring stories and making them fascinating. Because of his credibility and his expertise as a newsman, Levinson has managed to do some of the Associated Press's best work. I want you to go to page 227 now and follow along with me, okay? So you'll see at the top there, it starts with Warren Levinson's AP style report. It opens with the sound of jackhammers, running water, and construction noise. Can you picture that? There are time bombs under New York, aged a century or more. The one that went off on Thursday was put in 1904. The water mains under 42nd Street gave way. Then Gaynor speaks. Some of our older mains, that's safe to say. Dick Gaynor is a deputy of H2O Supply. Half gainer is the sort of thing that you or he or I might have been tempted to attempt instead of catch the train, since what subway tracks were under equaled 40 weeks of rain. And subway riders, feeling more than usually harassed, saw detours. Were they mad? Then Martinez, no, New Yorkers are adaptable. They adjust fast. Manuel Martinez got them round the crippled 4 and 5 train, while road and track were closed to anything that has a drivetrain. We don't whitewater raft here, but you could bob like a cork as you swish down 42nd, Warren Levinson, New York. And then it closes with the sound of more running water, jackhammers, and construction noises. So what did you think of that poetry style report? And that's a news report. So Levinson also emphasizes the importance of ambient sound. He reminds you not to overlook the sounds that doesn't come in quotes. So things like the street sounds of a fire rescue story, or the special acoustics of an art gallery or a museum. Don't use background sound for its own sake, but ask yourself, are there sounds that can tell an aspect of the story more concisely than I can do in words? Okay, let that sink in. So personalizing news, put yourself into it, but keep your opinion out of it. Sometimes it works very well when a reporter expresses genuine feelings about a story. It would have been almost shocking to American viewers and listeners if reporters had managed to seem emotion-free during the events of 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina. Stay objective with the facts, but retain your humanity. Okay, you're still a human being. If you are genuinely moved by a story and you can personalize it in some way, the audience will be more likely to remember your work. So while it's best to keep your personal opinion out of the news, wherever there is a personal connection to a story or the part of the reporter, there's potential for more powerful radio. And then we need to talk about how to interview people for news. So there's an art to the interview. The interview is the heart of the news story. When a reporter comes armed with a list of questions for an expert or a spokesperson or a victim, it's easy to forget the most important thing, which is listening. Do you remember last term we spoke about that? We spoke about how to listen and about not to simply rely on your list of questions, but to listen to what you're hearing and to pick up on that. The reporter is so eager to get to the next item on his or her list that the real story might be missed. Your most important interviewing tool are your listening skills and your natural curiosity. Often, if you let go of your question list and simply hear what your interviewee has said or has to say, you'll ask smarter questions and get more interesting answers and present a better story. Ask simpler questions to generate simpler answers. When interviewing an expert, there's this tendency to let them get away with giving these long, drawn-out, complex, and incomprehensible answers. The problem is that journalists don't like to admit that they don't know something or they don't understand a complicated answer. But if you, a broadcast professional, don't get it, what are the odds that your audience will? Nobody likes to feel or look foolish, but it's your job to make sure that you get a straightforward answer to your question. It's better to admit that you don't understand something and try again for a simpler answer than to leave your audience in the dark. After all, even your expert wants to be heard and understood. The basics of these interview techniques are to be prepared, to have a genuine curiosity. It's actually quite obvious when you really do want to do something. And of course, to listen. If you present the news in an interesting, topical, and relevant way, the audience will consider it a reason to tune in, not to tune out. Listeners will feel that they can't go a day without finding out what's going on, as explained through your newscast. Okay, they'll want to hear what you're saying. These are tips from reporters of various newsrooms who share their most important lessons. And let's start from the top then. The first one, talk to one listener at a time. Remember, you speak to one person. Radio is radio is one-on-one, so one person at a time. Use silence. It's powerful. If there's a big silence gap, use it. Avoid cliches. Get new ideas from calling on old story sources. Off the record means off the record. Don't burn your sources. You might need them again. Is collecting audio actuality or doing an interview worth the effort? Can you better use the little time that you have on another story? That's something that you need to keep in mind, because deadlines are very tight on news reporting. Localize. Know your city and use familiar terms for things. Keep a tease. Make them want more later. Okay, so don't give away everything at once. Don't use the same lead that the reporter uses. It's lazy and boring, and it makes you look stupid. Rewrite all the source material and use multiple versions. Don't use the 8 o'clock copy at the 9 o'clock for the 9 o'clock news bulletin. Use one thought per sentence, one thought per actuality. Write to be heard. Maintain a sense of speech rhythm in your writing. Read it out loud before you read it on air. Avoid statistics if you can. Listeners don't usually remember them. No one knows what's in your sound recorder or on your computer or on your phone except for you. Only use the best and the most powerful sounds. Save time by listening to recorded audio on the way back to your studio. So mentally have your multi-versions ready to go before you start editing. Make decisions. You will never get every detail into a story. Decide what goes in and what to leave out of each story version. Okay, now I want you to turn to page 231. So let's quickly look at Valerie Geller's tips. So at the top there, page 231, Valerie Geller, Geller Media International's tips for creating powerful news. Number 2, describe things visually, paint word pictures. Number 3, write shorter. Use fewer words, but make them count. When in doubt, leave it out. Use effective storytelling techniques. Tell stories the way you would tell them to friends. Number 5, use natural sound. Number 6, stay objective. Keep your opinion out of the story, but put your humanity into it. Number 7, really listen when you are interviewing. Ask simpler questions. Know when to ask a what and a how question versus a yes or a no question. Number 8, understand your story well enough that if the copy blew away, you could still continue your report. Number 9, make the news part of your station's programming, not an interruption. Tease upcoming news between newscasts. And lastly, number 10, present a solution for every problem if possible. More great ideas come from veteran newsman Ed Walsh. So Walsh has worked with top stations and networks in Boston, Phoenix, and New York. And he says, know when to file. The appetite of the news monster is insatiable. In the US, radio news deadlines are rarely more than an hour away. Better to give the bee something accurate to chew on while you're collecting more information for a follow-up report. Wearing comfortable shoes can't be overemphasized. Imagine running up and down in heels or in very smart shoes. The value of most press releases received rarely exceeds the cost of the bandwidth required to send them. Okay, so we don't really use press releases. In real estate, the top 3 attributes of a property are location, location, location. And in radio news, it's local, local, local. That often means developing local angles to national or international stories. No verb in news writing is more overused than say, as in officials say. Put some life into your copy. They don't say, they insist, they maintain, they claim, and so on. Avoid over-attribution. The name of the press flag for any agency is, in the vast majority of stories, not necessary to report. Officer Smith, in his capacity as a spokesman, is the police. Okay. Never lapse into non-conversational transitional phrases such as closer to home or in other news. If you can't develop a declarative lead, pose an interrogatory, have you ever? It makes a much more plausible transition between stories. Establish presence by pre-filing when you won't be able to phone in, radio in, or send an audio file at the time of the event. If a reporter is to be at the airport for the Pope's 11 o'clock arrival, he can't file at 11. Okay, so pre-file, the Pope is expected here shortly, etc. Remember, when doing news, we're doing news, not history. Use the present tense wherever possible. Don't refer to yesterday unless chronology is crucial. Tell me a story, a true one, but a story. Never pass up a chance to go to the bathroom. Ever staked out a story in the early morning after having had too much coffee? And always say yes when they offer you free food and drink. And then Saren Katchen also has radio news tips. She says, quality never goes out of style. Don't run with rumors. Keep your views out of the news. Take notes. Sound recording devices can fail. Accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. Report fully and fairly. Omitting major facts or viewpoints is bad reporting. It's not news to barge into a disaster or a crime scene and ask a victim, how do you feel? Listen, the best questions come from answers. Good reporting and good sound make good radio. If it's not clear to you, it won't be clear to your listeners. Then what I want you to go and do in your own time, please do go and do this. It's part of your... Remember that you need to do independent learning also, okay? Is to go and read the rest of those pages. So read page 233, Mark Howell's Creating Powerful Radio News Tips. Page 234, Denise Jimenez Adams' Word of Advice. And 235, Lynn Jimenez, Creating Powerful Radio News Tips. Okay, so just go and read those 3. And then I want you to think, and I want you to look at this multiple choice quiz. I want you to choose the best answer according to the text. Okay. Number 1, radio news uses these tools to help listeners visualize what is happening. A recorder and a mic. B, an interview and interviewee. C, immediacy and imagery. Or D, reporter and anchor. Which one do you think is the correct answer? And then number 2, Mike Sugarman's example of covering the Academy Awards by interviewing people named Oscar is an example of A, never be boring. B, doing what everyone else is doing. C, laughing at the competition. Or D, focusing on his audience. Which one do you think? And then number 3, When conducting an interview, the most important thing for a reporter to remember is to A, turn on the recorder, B, face the person being interviewed, C, know what the next question to be asked is, or D, to listen. Then true or false, number 4. Sound should never be used in a news story. Is that true or is that false? Number 5, Geller's top 10 news tips include making news a part of your station's programming. True or false? So of all the news tips offered in this chapter, describe how you have used at least one of the tips to help you become a better news reporter. Okay, please answer these yourself. Crit yourself to see whether you understand what we just went through or whether you don't. So in summary, news does not come naturally, okay? All 5 of your senses must be alive in order to find news. Everyone is a resource and knows of many other resources for stories. Work as an individual, but develop as a team. And lastly, over 50% of our time awake is spent listening. Develop the skill, whether it's for news, whether it's for presenting, it's a skill, or whether it's for being an amazing interviewer. You need to develop the skill of listening. And that brings me to the end of this lecture. Please do me a favor and go and reread these things. There's a lot of context in this class, so we went through a lot of stuff, but you need to make sure that you understand them, okay? And with that, I say goodbye until our next lesson, where we will be continuing in this chapter and with weather and traffic and sport. Until then, I say goodbye. Bye.